On the line right now, Mark Meckler. He is the president of the Convention of States Action Group, and they're out with new polling data that shows that the vast majority of voters across the United States want the new Congress to repeal the 87,000 new IRS agents that Joe Biden is trying to hire right now. Mark Meckler, thanks again for joining us again here on Breitbart News Saturday. Talk to us about this poll.
Yeah, I think it's funny, Matt, because I can't imagine anybody would be surprised by this. If you just go ask your friends and neighbors what they think of the IRS, generally speaking, unless they work for the IRS, you're not going to hear much positive. So the idea of hiring 87,000 new IRS agents actually is pretty terrifying to most Americans. You get that note in the mail that says you're being audited or whatever. It's not a good day. You get a call from the IRS, not a good day. And so what we find is that the vast majority of Americans, and we did this poll with Trafalgar Group, so it's a legitimate nationwide poll, sampled over 1,000 likely voters. What you find is 60% of American voters want Congress to reverse the hiring of those IRS agents. And when you break it down by party lines, what you find is that the vast majority of Republicans, almost 85% of Republican voters are against it, 61% of independent voters, and even a quarter of Democrat voters. I'm surprised it's that low, but 26% of Democrat voters want that repealed.
Yeah, well, I mean, 26% of Democrats. I mean, that's still a lot of Democrats. I mean, that's 26% willing to break with their party on this. If I'm not mistaken, I believe the House of Representatives has passed already a bill that would do this, that would repeal the 87,000 IRS agents. I think that was their first order of business. So that's passed. Do you expect any action in the Senate on this? I mean, obviously the Democrats control the Senate. I don't know. Maybe people like Joe Manchin, people like Kirsten Sinema, who are going to face tough re-elections, or John Tester up in Montana, maybe they'd be willing to vote for something like this. Is there a way to maybe get it through the Senate and force Biden's hand on this, get the bill to President Biden's desk?
Yeah, I think it's possible, I would say, to get it through the Senate. I'm not going to say that it's likely, but I agree with you on the targets you said and maybe some others. Again, the IRS is just inherently unpopular among the American people. I think the problem with getting it done in the Senate is what Democrats have done, and why you see it's only 26% of Democrats are in favor of this repeal, is because they've convinced their constituents that the only people that are going to be audited, the only people that are going to pay these 87,000 IRS agents are very wealthy people. And Democrats like to do this war between the rich and the poor. The reality is we know from actual numbers that literally poor people at the lowest end of the income scale, are 5 times more likely to be audited by the IRS than wealthier people. The IRS targets poor people because they can't afford the lawyers and they can't afford the accountants to fight, and so that's who they target. But they've convinced their Democrat constituency that that's not the case. So I'd say it's a toss-up on whether it can make it through the Senate or not. And then I would say if it makes it to the president's desk, I think he's highly likely to veto it. Mainly because he really actually doesn't care about the American people. He doesn't care what they think. I don't think he even necessarily knows what they think, and certainly his advisors would advise him to veto this.
Right. So on the point of the who they would audit, these IRS agents, you're 100% right. They're not going to go after by the way, even if they did audit every millionaire and billionaire in America, they'd be done before long. I mean, a lot of these guys have pro accountants and lawyers and whatnot that are going through and doing their taxes, making sure they're not getting into audit pitfalls anyway, right? They'd run out of steam on that front before long, and then who are they going to go after that? Right, like they're gonna have nothing to do all day, and that's one of the most dangerous things out there. I think is a government bureaucracy and a rogue agency with nothing to do, right, with time on their hands, right? Like, because what are they gonna do?
Exactly.
They're gonna go after the regular people. They're gonna go after people like you and me and regular folks out there across the country.
Yeah, and honestly, that's where the real money is, and because what people have this idea in their minds maybe that, well, if you just audit all the billionaires, well, like you said, the billionaires are actually, generally speaking, doing their taxes correctly. They've got the lawyers, they've got the accountants, they can afford to pay literally tens of thousands of dollars a year to make sure everything's perfect, every I is dotted, every T is crossed, and every loophole is taken advantage of legally. That's what most really wealthy people do. Where people run into problems is, people make good faith mistakes. People don't really know how to do their taxes that well. They make $25,000, $30,000, $50,000 a year. They're doing their taxes themselves, or they've got low-end tax preparers, and so they make mistakes. That's where the IRS finds the most of their money in audits. Like I said, I mean, the numbers are in literally over 5 times as likely for low-income people to be audited and to have problems with the IRS than wealthy people.
Right. So this was a big part of why the Tea Party movement really took off, a decade ago, is, or even more than a decade ago now. I guess it's 2023. Wow, time flies. It was 2010 when I got my start, and that was in the Tea Party movement. But we saw the IRS going after conservative organizations and conservative groups and conservative leaders. Can you talk to us a little bit about that? Because I think that's a real risk here, is that, again, they're going to run out of billionaires to audit before long, very quickly. And then what are they going to do? They're going to, all these people that are going to be hired at the IRS, that are going to be IRS agents, maybe not all of them, but the vast majority of them, 90% of them, are going to be these liberal idealists. And then what are they going to do? They're going to go start auditing conservative organizations again. That's exactly where this is going.
Yeah, and I have very, very personal experience with this. During that time period, I got my start just like you did out of the Tea Party movement. And during that time period, what we saw is the IRS targeting conservative organizations and conservative individuals, not just for audit, but denying them their charitable status when they were filing for charitable registration, and just generally harassing conservatives. And I can tell you, having watched the IRS and been intimately involved with that, we ended up suing the IRS, funding a lawsuit against the IRS, class action. We ended up having to settle that class action for $3.7 million. It's the only time I'm ever aware of the IRS ever having to pay out like that. And yet, that might sound satisfying. It's not, because what I saw is there was literally no reform that came out of that. So the same things that were in place that allowed them to attack Tea Party groups are still in place. Now you add 87,000 agents and a lot of money to the IRS, and there's no doubt in my mind they're going to weaponize that, just like they've weaponized the DOJ, the FBI, every other agency against conservatives. I think this is why when you look at that polling and you see almost 90% of Republicans say that they're opposed to this, that's because we understand what they're going to do with this money.
Right. So now, more broadly, Mark, I want to get you to lay out, because we oftentimes get a lot of callers about this. I know Mark Levin's very fired up about it, and this is the charge of your guys' organization, Convention of States Action, is you guys are trying to get a convention of states as laid out in the Constitution. Right. Can you lay out for us what is a convention of states? How does the Constitution provide for this? Where do we stand, and then we'll get into where we stand and whatnot in a few minutes. But just lay out for us, what is a convention of states? What would happen if one is triggered? How does that work?
Sure. So Article 5 of the United States Constitution contains 2 clauses, and it says how we get to amend the Constitution if we want to do that. The first way is whenever 2/3 of both houses of Congress decide an amendment is necessary, they can propose that amendment. They put it out to the states for ratification, and it takes 3/4 of states to ratify that amendment. Mm-hmm. And that's the way we've gotten all 27 amendments that we have. The second clause of Article 5 says that if the states decide an amendment is necessary and they can't get Congress to do it, then when 2/3 of the states decide they'd like to gather and propose an amendment, they can do that. The method is the state legislatures alone, no governor's signature necessary. When the majority of both houses of the state legislature say they want to call a convention, they pass a resolution calling for that convention, and then they submit that to Congress. And when 34 states have done that, then the convention is called. So the Convention of States project itself, the organization I run, is involved in doing this. And the way that works is we have a resolution being proposed in all the state legislatures. And the resolution basically says it has 3 subject matter areas. It says that the convention, once called, will discuss anything that would impose term limits on federal officials and Congress. So that's Congress plus bureaucrats and staffers, the deep state. Says the convention can discuss anything that would impose fiscal restraints on the federal government, like a balanced budget amendment, tax caps, spending caps. And it says they can discuss anything that would impose scope and jurisdiction restraints. And that means telling the federal government what it can't do, things that it never should have done, like being involved in education or energy or healthcare. We could do away with those kinds of agencies. So that's the basic process of how it works.
Okay, so now the reason why this would be necessary, I would argue, and I think you would too, is when you're considering things like term limits, why would members of Congress vote for that? Now, they've agreed, apparently Kevin McCarthy, the Speaker of the House, has agreed to have a vote on whether or not we should have term limits as one of the conditions for him winning the speakership. Now, but still, I don't expect that to pass the U.S. Congress, because why would all these members of Congress vote to term limit themselves, right? Like, so some of them will, but like I don't expect things like that. So part of the reason why and the thinking behind pushing for something like this is that it would the other way of doing it, the first way, the way that we've gotten all these other amendments, would require members of Congress voting to strip themselves of their own power, which I don't think they're going to do. So can you explain that for us? Like, because I think that's part of the thinking as to why that you need to go this route rather than that route.
Yeah, I think you nailed it. And what you're doing there is you're essentially paraphrasing George Mason, who in 1787 addressed the convention that was drafting the Constitution. It's right before the end of the convention. It's September 15th, 1787. And he asked the convention a question. He said, we've got this big problem because we drafted a document that gives the power to Congress to propose amendments, but we didn't give that same power to the people acting through the states. And then he asked them, are we so naive that we believe that a government that becomes tyrannical will ever propose amendments to restrain their own tyranny? That's what you're saying, though, in modern English, right? Like, people don't restrain themselves. That's just not how human nature works. And what we know from Madison's notes of convention is that there wasn't even any debate. This was not something people thought, oh, well, that seems like a crazy idea. They all kind of slapped their foreheads and said, well, yeah, of course, we're going to need to restrain them. And they voted unanimously to give us this power because human beings don't give up power without a fight. They don't just, we have no recorded evidence in human history of any leader ever saying, you know what, I think that the government has too much power, let's give it back to the people. So we're going to have to take it back if we want it back.
Right. Okay. So now, lay out for us where things are at on this front right now, because I know you guys have been working on this for many years.
Yep.
How many states have adopted the resolution? How fast do they have to do it? Like, where give us the lay of the land on this right now.
Yep. So far, 19 states have passed it, so we're well past the halfway mark. So we need another 15 states to go to get it done. We're just starting legislative session this year. Most people don't realize, unless they really pay attention to this stuff, state legislatures, the majority of them are part-time, so they all went into session, or the majority of them, in the beginning of January. They'll run from anywhere from end of February through, say, beginning of May, so they're all short sessions. So we're out there, we're in the states. I was just in North Carolina yesterday. We're active North Carolina, Montana, Idaho, Iowa, Wyoming, all over the country. This is moving. I expect this year that we'll pass at a minimum 4 more. Kind of the mantra is 23 and 23. I expect that we'll pass number 20 here pretty quickly. I'm going to be in Wyoming in the next few days. That's looking very good. Montana looks very good. A bunch of the other states I just mentioned all look good. So I think the momentum is with us, and I expect somewhere between 4 and 7 states will pass this year.
Okay, so now did the 34 states have to pass it like within a certain time frame, like within a decade of each other? Like, so like if you get to the 23 or more, I mean, then you're still 10 or so away, or there's abouts. But like, I mean, do you have to go back and pass it out of some of the ones that have already passed again? Like, do they have to pass it?
No, there's no time limitation unless a state puts what's called a sunset clause on a resolution. So some legislation and some of these resolutions have sunset clauses in them. We had 4 states overall that have put sunset clauses in them. 2 states have already removed those sunset clauses, meaning now those resolutions will stick around until they're rescinded. Or legislature could rescind them at any time by doing the same thing, having a resolution rescinding. This year, I think we'll remove the sunset clause that's in the Texas resolution. We're working. Nebraska has a sunset clause in it as well. Neither of them is in danger of expiring yet, but we're likely to remove those. So most of them do not have any kind of time limitation on them, though.
Okay, so the goal is to just keep building and get closer and closer to 34. So this year you get to 23, 24, 25, something like that. Do you think that maybe next year or the year after that, you're within striking distance here of a convention of states?
I do. I think, look, I'm always an optimist, so I want to say that up front. And,
Mm-hmm.
doing what I do over the long haul, you got to
Mm-hmm.
be an optimist. And so right now I'm shooting for closing this out in 2026.
2026. Wow, that would be really incredible. Especially if President Trump's back in the White House and he can be the president when this all goes down. We'll see. So the last thing I would ask you about here, Mark, is that you do hear from some people out there on the right who are concerned about runaway conventions. Rightly, we've heard
Yep.
from the Eagle Forum folks to that effect. What do you say to those people? What do you say about the concern that if this happens, the left is going to hijack the convention and use it for its purposes? What do you
Well,
say to
so
that?
I'm going to say something. I'm going to say something to you that I don't normally say. That this is just a new piece of information. That if
Mm-hmm.
you really, because what they're worried about is the left taking over convention, and they'll
Mm-hmm.
tell you that the left really wants this to happen, and this is actually just a plot by George Soros, and the left loves convention of states. I hear this all the time. I get accused of being paid by George Soros. Funny, you and I go back to the beginning of the Tea Party movement together. So I hear these are kind of the arguments I hear. And I think that we should look at what the left thinks if you listen to those arguments. And there was a hit piece that came out 2 days ago, literally by Media Matters. Anybody can look this up. Look up Media Matters and Tucker Carlson and Mark Meckler, because I was on Tucker's show. I did an hour on the Tucker Carlson Today show. And Media Matters lays out what the left believes we're trying to accomplish. And when I read the article, I think, wow, they pretty much got it right. They say we want term limits, we want a balanced budget, we want to dismantle the administrative state, we want a very small, limited government. They hate all that stuff, obviously, and they talk about how much they hate it, and they're really worried that we're going to do it. So that's what the left thinks about what Convention of States is doing. So when you hear Eagle Forum say that this is a plot by the left, or you hear the John Birch Society say it's a plot by the left, every leftist organization in the United States of America is against Convention of States. They've actually come out and signed a press release against it. It's Planned Parenthood, it's La Raza, it's MoveOn.org, it's Daily Cause, it's all of them. Every America-hating, baby-killing, communist organization in the United States of America is against Convention of States. So that would be my first argument. Like, if you think this
Mm-hmm.
is a bad thing, okay, well, then just acknowledge you're with George Soros, Planned Parenthood, Common Cause, and MoveOn.org. That's your side. But the reality is of a runaway convention, the simplest argument, Matt, is math.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, even if you presume there could be a runaway convention, and I can argue every reason there can't be, but presume there can be, you still have to get 38 states to ratify anything that comes out of the convention. And I would challenge your listeners, anybody who's concerned about this, think of whatever kind of amendment you wouldn't like, and then try to list the 38 states that would pass that. You can't do it. I hear it about the Second Amendment all the time. We're going to lose the Second Amendment, Mark. You're putting it at risk. There are actually 25 states with constitutional carry now. You don't need a permit to carry your gun. 24 where you can carry your gun in the legislature, and 14 where you can take your loaded AR into the legislature, slung across your back, and sit in the gallery. The idea that we could find 38 states to ratify an amendment repealing the Second Amendment is just ludicrous. It's ridiculous. And so their arguments don't make any sense, and their arguments are just serving the radical left in America, and the radical left loves Eagle Forum and loves the John Birch Society now.
Right, but if I do, well, it would be 38 states to find. It would be difficult to find 38 states to do that stuff. I do think you could find 38 states that would go for term limits, for instance. I do think you could find 30. I mean, it's still going to be tough. Don't get me wrong. I mean, a convention comes. This is going to be a tough uphill slog. However, I think it's doable. So, if people want term limits, this is the way to do it.
You're saying something really important, which is what's going to come out of convention are things that are broadly acceptable to the American people. And this is a little bit of a downside for me, Matt. The really radically conservative stuff that I might want, that's not going to make it. You know, if I wanted a life amendment defining life as at conception, you couldn't get 38 states to ratify that. I want that, but you could not get that. But what you can get is 85% of the American people are in favor of term limits. 85% of the American people roughly are in favor of some kind of balanced budget amendment. I can tell you it's over 90% on one of my favorites, which I think would be really fundamental, is a single subject amendment. We can literally prevent these giant omnibus bills. 41 states have single subject amendments in their constitution that say every bill, one subject. And it would prevent Congress from passing a lot of legislation. They don't have time to pass all the bills that they stuff into these giant omnibus bills. And so imagine if every bill, single subject, limited amount of pages, it would really grind Washington, D.C. to a slow crawl.
Yeah, really interesting stuff. Mark Meckler, sir, really want to thank you for joining us here on Breitbart News Saturday. Where can people go to learn more about what you guys are doing in convention states and get involved if they so choose?
Yeah. Hey, Matt, I also just want to thank you for being in the fight for so long. I mean, you're one of the original guys that came into the Tea Party along with people like me. So God bless you for sticking it out. And people can find out about Convention Estates by going to conventionestates.com.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Always a pleasure. Look forward to having you back again soon.